Welcome to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nic King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws with Nic King and Kate Fox. And this week we are going to talk about Autdar. Oh, you call it Autdar, don't you?
I call it Autdar because I quite like, it aligns more closely then to gaydar, and I suppose I'm probably unconsciously covering ADHD-dar as well as autism-dar. And of course, when I first heard it, it was called Aspidar. We don't say that anymore.
We do not say that anymore.
Aspidar.
Yeah. So, spotting other neurodivergent people in the wild. Out. In the out space. Or in the in space. Or online.
So many spaces. Well, for starters, I would have immediately spotted you anywhere today because you're wearing a mushroom top and giving it another mushroom.
A rainbowy mushroom top, which should actually, if we're rewriting the diagnostic criteria, should rainbows and mushrooms be there?
Yes, and octopuses.
You like an octopus? Yeah. And dungarees.
Yeah. And dungarees.
Dungarees.
Any type of comfy shoes or comfy clothes. But Autdar or Autdar is wider than the superficial and appearances. But that's part of it, isn't it? It's part of what we can see. We're going to examine how we spot our fellow tribes members. And we do spot them, don't we? That's the thing. We do spot them everywhere.
I could get the waiting list down to a fortnight. Just line them up.
Exactly.
But do 100 at a time.
And it's not... See, it's funny because sometimes, I think it sounds like we might have different approaches to what happens when your Autdar or Autdar pings.
Yes. And yes. So not only do I have a habit, and I am not suggesting that everyone should do this or that it's even a good thing. I am just saying this is what I do. It's not necessarily advice. Possibly don't try this at home. I don't know. It's just how I am. And I tell people I am a teller. I will just be like, yeah, you should go think about that or go sort that out. You can get a letter about that if you want to. We even have a household, we have a sign. Within our house, we have a sign. If we think people are autistic around us, which isn't possibly going to work over a podcast, but it kind of is a bit like a rainbow jazz hands. It's this is what it is for those who are watching in a visual. But it's sort of like a slightly a spread palmed thing in a sort of slightly rainbowed pattern. And that's what we do. And I think for spotting others. And we're like,
I love that. I love that, an ethnographer or an anthropologist who studies cultures would be like, they have signs. They have signs that they use among themselves in the wild. Absolutely. I like the thought of you all lined up like the
just doing this,
doing it, and the poor object of this being like, is there some sort of flash mob of the Sound of Music happening that I've missed? What's going on?
I mean, in my household, probably that too.
Right. Yeah, yes. I can only imagine. I've experienced, it's a lovely feeling actually, isn't it? As well, when so partly you're sharing information, but I'm thinking of when watching a TV program, say, and so I'm, as an example, Taskmaster, and I'm not going to name a particular contestant. Actually, I'm feeling circumspect here, but when there is one, and you're like, that's one of ours. Yeah, that's one of ours, and you're just happy to see them there.
Yes,
it's like doing their thing in their autistic.
We've been doing that with Jeopardy. You know how Jeopardy's come onto ITV, I think. Anyway, it started recently on a British broadcasting type channel, and we've been doing that a lot with Jeopardy recently. There's been a lot of ND people on Jeopardy. And
so to go back to then, what are the signs? What are the signals? What are they doing on Jeopardy that tells you?
I think there's something in our body language that is different, and definitely not a deficit, but different. And I think I was having a laugh the other day because our local authority have put out some things around EHCPs, and there's an autism section that talks about limited facial expressions. Now, I, dear viewer, I do not have limited facial expressions. In fact, my thumbnails that come through for my social media teams for when I do reels and stuff like that are actually quite upsetting. And I didn't have a limited facial expression when they shared that. But I do think there is something in our expressions, in our body language, in the way we stand, in the way we stand when we're next to people. So I will always sort of attempt to be all kind of parallel if I can get away with it. Like, how if you're in a car, you are parallel on a line, and then I will try and sort of move degrees round, but I would never choose to face somebody if I could get away with it.
Yeah.
And I think we as a community do things like that naturally, and that it's comfortable for us. It feels safe. It feels validating. And obviously those are nice feelings to have, which I think is often why not only do we go about spotting each other, but we're spotting each other because you want to find, your Neuro Kin. You want to find your fellow person, so you can feel that sort of that comfort and that safety, and to know that, your communication, be that, verbally or in terms of body language, or, the whole thing is just going to be that little bit easier.
This is such a crucial point, isn't it? The idea of it's a safety mechanism to be able to spot your Neuro Kin, because they're less likely to mock you or reject you just for your facial expressions, body language. Never mind, this is without getting into what people say, their reactions to things, how they express themselves. I think that feels like such a, and I do think a lot of what evolutionary psychologists say is bollocks, but it feels like there's an evolutionary primal imperative here around safety, actually, which is why so many autistic and other neurodivergent people cluster together. Where will you find us? In the kitchen at parties. Not necessarily, but some of us will be there, sheltering from the noise, for example, one example.
And holding a beverage. It's important to hold a beverage. You need something in your hand.
Yes. Otherwise, what would you do with these appendages that sometimes awkwardly
flap a boot? Flap a boot.
Flap a boot, indeed. Flap a boot.
Not that there's anything we fully endorse flapping about.
Yes, flapping. Oh yeah, I suppose that's a more traditional. See, that's the thing.
A more spotting way, looking at other people's stimming.
Yeah. And actually, maybe and because a lot of my Art of Autdar works on fellow adults, actually, not, I was going to say more women, but not particularly, just adults, perhaps a more explicit and usual thing associated with autistic people, such as hand flapping, less likely to happen. I think it is the more subtle things that I'm used to spotting, like someone, pressing their
pen
obsessively, or I sit in a lot of audiences, and it's so interesting. Like, some people just sit still. How do they do that?
I think I had that moment, when like 2020 happened and we all went on Zoom. And thank goodness that we did. But it was that moment where I was like looking at other people in like the gallery view, and I'm like, they're still.
Yeah.
I was like, what's with that? Why are they still? She says, like, rocking sideways on her chair as we speak.
Exactly. They're not twirling their hair. I noticed, I'm as in a sort of just a gentle habitual rhythm. And I was only quite recently, I noticed this. My foot is, my toes are on the floor, but my heel is not on the floor. And I'm sort of like lifting and falling on my toes and my foot. I'm just gently doing that. Oh, wow. See, that's weird, isn't it? We're literally talking about this. But I'm unconsciously at the time tapping my fingers as well, and it's only when I'm doing that.
Yeah. So I do a lot of sort of like sideways rocking on my chair. I also have like I jokingly call it the bed of nails, but it's not a bed of nails. It's an acupressure mat. So I have an acupressure mat on the floor under my desk, because I do need a rather large amount of feedback in order to be still enough to work. Not that I am currently still, because I am not still, but to remain seated would be like, that's where we are. And when I deliver stuff in person, like, I can remember somebody, like, sometimes they give you head mics, and my hands are like everywhere, and like I'm quite regularly bashing said head mic. Yeah. How do we spot this? But yeah, I think a huge amount in body language, and that is partly about stimming. I think it's about where we stand. I think it's about the kind of eye contact we make.
Yes, because of course this is people are still managing to not get diagnosed because they're making.
Because you looked at somebody's eyeball.
And of course, turns out we can, we've learned to, maybe we even want to. Although when I was little, so I would often notice, and it took a long time to work this out, so people would look at me, but then their eyes would go to the corner of the room. But that was not them doing that. That was them trying to work out why my eyes had gone to the corner of the room, and they would be following my eyes. I was like, people are weird. Their eyes go to their... Oh, see, it's me. Actually, it's me. And I now cannot... I have to... Actually, eye contact is a particular one where it's still quite hard for me to work out, am I masking? Am I doing a socially accepted thing to make people feel okay? Because I quite often will. I'm aware that some degree of eye contact might be useful to someone to show them listening, and then I'm, with them. I'm not completely sure what I do when I'm left to my own devices, but I can spot in others, I think, something that's, maybe the dance that I'm doing that isn't really eye contact.
I think something I realised again in 2020, God bless 2020, I didn't realise how much I lip read until everybody put a mask on. And then I was like, oh, I can't hear. And obviously, yeah. And I think a lot of times my lip reading is mistaken for eye contact.
Ah, yes.
Because I am looking at their face.
Yes.
But obviously it's not the same thing.
No. So these are some of the physical things that we're saying. And then the ADR really kicks in when someone starts talking, I think.
Yes.
Both in the things they say and how they say. I mean, for me, I think I'm really happy that I spot. In fact, there's a particular, I saw again because I went into the same cafe in town recently. In fact, there's a cluster in this particular cafe on Northumberland Street, a very enjoyable ND cluster. I presume an ND manager has is in charge of the hiring, and they get their fellows, because actually it's a chain and it's not a characteristic of this chain particularly that they have ND staff, but it is of this branch. They're really joyful to watch, actually. And what I enjoyed about her, so apart from that her dress had guinea pigs on, one of the things, but then there's just this joyfulness, this just a lot of energy in her speech, and I suppose like me and you, really, we're kind of at the more energetic end. And almost I want to, I don't know, it feels, because how I'm spotting it in my body and my mind, and so now I feel like I'm turning into words something that is also quite unconscious, and maybe the words are the wrong words, but there's something about, there's an innocence about her that I really enjoy, just this guileless, yay, the world thing, and that I enjoy spotting that.
I particularly enjoy people being candid and it's unbridled, the word I want, like, about their passions, and that comes down to monotropism, and our sort of interests and how intensely we can deep dive them. And even if I'm not interested in that other person's interest, I love listening to autistic people talk about their passions. But weirdly enough, that monotropic flow is very much sort of negatively framed and pinned within the diagnosis criteria. And I think neurotypical people don't like listening to that quite regularly.
That is such a lot.
Yeah. But I think each other, I think there is something in the body language that we recognize, that we then feel like that we can do that.
Yeah, and then it becomes shared. And actually, the word unbridled is interesting. So I feel like so much, and both our experiences are experiences of the UK, aren't they?
Yes.
And if we were in a Mediterranean culture, I think maybe we would be talking about this a little bit differently. I don't know, because there's something about we are encouraged. Generally, it's something we hear in school, actually, and you hear growing up. It's kind of like, oh, don't be too much. Hold yourself in. Don't get too excited. Mm-hmm. Don't too much, especially for women, but not just for women. But it is particular for women. And actually, the height of that is a successfully middle class woman whose facial expressions are not too much, whose bodily expressions are not too much, who doesn't talk about one subject and certainly doesn't get excited. Now, the same kind of prescriptions don't hold as much, actually, for maybe working. I know class is a taboo. Imagine trying to talk to audiences about class and asking them what class they are was even maybe slightly harder than saying, "Are you autistic?" I think. Yeah. But there are so many invisible codes for displaying class, and so one of them is not to be too much. Yes, it's so interesting that you're saying that we are more likely as fellow ND people to enjoy that thing which is perceived as too much elsewhere. And is it partly because it's a bit scary to have these social codes that people have imbibed and agreed to go along with being broken in front of them? It's like, oh, well, that's not in the code. You can't.
It's such a specific tiny area that the code sometimes doesn't work. I talk about that in Neurodivergence. I tell kids about how up in the northeast where we are, it's acceptable and normal to talk to other people on public transport. You go 300 miles down the road, it's not. And how can there be social rules culturally if we can't even get them right within a couple of hundred miles of each other? Never mind internationally. I was delivering training in China, not in China, over Zoom to people in China, and I was aware that pointing's really rude over there, and my hands are everywhere, and I was kind of trying to be mindful, not to be offensive, You know, but this is the thing as well, I suppose, that can you see others cognitively thinking about that all the time? Oh, because we are processing those social rules and what we should and shouldn't be doing all the time. And is that visible?
I would say, well, isn't part of it that often, so for people of the predominant neurotype, just to use Luke Bearden's term, I quite like that.
Okay.
They're not having to think about these social rules because they've just absorbed them. That's the point. They've become automatic. They're absorbed. They're just living them. That's just how they are. So they've become unconscious to a great degree. And I think conversely, so therefore, a bit disturbing for them to see people breaking the social rules. Bit disturbing. So speaking for me personally, I really struggle with watching some neurotypical people.
Or like Love Island.
Oh, no, well, yeah, exactly. I don't even watch that. Also, that would be terrible. No, exactly. I have to avoid that because there is something about, but they're just living these rules, and I can see that they're not unbridled, and there's something else in there. I mean, it's more disturbing if you can feel what Autdar isn't just, it's an attuned sense or feeling often of the energies of other people and how those energies are either flowing or being restricted, being let out, being kept in. And actually, so therefore that can be quite a disturbing thing I can find in other people when I sense that so much is being held back, really.
Yes. Yeah. And then you don't know how to respond, do you, quite often, because it doesn't come naturally, because it doesn't feel natural.
Yeah, exactly. And there can be a mismatch. And so, again, here's one of the ironies, autistic people are supposed to be not good at reading or interpreting communication. But often what's actually happening is a lot of information is coming towards us from somebody all at once. And some of it will be verbal and some will be the non-verbal stuff. And that non-verbal it can be a bit more clear, well, theoretically clear, like body language, or subtler, like energy in the body. So not in a woo spiritual sense, but just like literally where the energy.
How much we are, how much we are processing.
Yes.
Or not.
And it's a lot of process. And often we're actually, therefore, it's comes then to the thing of a lot of autistic people are hyper empathic because they're really able to feel in their body and self what someone else is feeling, or let's say, to speak more vaguely, the vibe they're giving off. And it's like, oh, hang on, they're saying this, but that is not the vibe I'm getting off of them at all. In fact, I think they're really angry, and but they're telling me that they're really okay and everything is fine and they're really happy. But and it's a difficult mismatch. So personally, I enjoy the company of neurodivergent people more, often because there's not the mismatch. I'm not having to decode completely clashing communication energies.
Yes. Everything. Yeah. So are you a teller? So if I'm a teller, are you going like, do you know you're autistic? Do you know you're ADHD? Do you?
Less so now, interestingly. So if we are in a conversation or a context where they are saying something like, I just think there's something and I don't know what it is, I feel like they've got permission to say, and so I have done this many times, have you thought about autism, ADHD? But if it is just out and about, then no. And maybe less so now. I'm about to cough, actually. Hang on. Oh, that was exciting. First on a cough, but I pressed the mute button. It was all fine. Maybe nowadays I have a bit more faith that they will find that there will be a path. They will see somewhere else. They will hear a podcast. They will watch a TV program. They'll see a book. And
they'll find an algorithm.
Yeah. Whereas in the past, maybe I was more of a teller because I thought otherwise there's no way they will ever know. And the reason that I hold back is because it's not a neutral process to have a diagnosis and go through it all. And I think sometimes people may not be ready. So maybe I have a vague hope that really at the right time, they will discover. I mean, the other day, but of course I was in a setting the other day where there were lots of people with other mental health diagnoses, and we were talking about how often loads of people in this setting, you know, who might have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, anxiety, depression, or bipolar. So I suppose we could say anxiety and depression are co-occurring conditions often with autism, whereas BPD and bipolar might well just be a misdiagnosis of autism. And so it feels like, people in that soup of labels, it would probably be potentially really helpful to have autism, ADHD thrown into the mix, although at the same time confusing. But it sounds like you feel like it's almost back to this unbridled honesty, really. You're like, hang on, but see, you are this. You should know this.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, like one of the few people who I haven't said it to. I mean, I'm not just approaching strangers on public transport. Do you know what I mean? There's a vague relationship there normally. But like, one of the few people I hadn't told because I thought they knew, came to me and they were like, Nic, I think I might be autistic. And I'm like, what? What? You have 9 diagnosed grandchildren. Hang on. What? You know that, don't you? And then they were like, why didn't you tell me? And I'm like, well, genuinely, because I thought you knew. And like, I didn't feel like we had to have that conversation at all. So yeah, I've been told off. I've never been told off for telling, but I have been told off for not telling. And yeah, I would just go around spotting people. I'm not sure there's huge amounts of science in that. Or whether we need science in that.
Well, what we're talking about is something that, although I think there are scientific methods that could capture it, I think we are talking about quite a subtle communication that happens, or a subtle perception. And it's interesting, you know, I would imagine that a lot more of the successful diagnostic processes are ones where that subtle perception is allowed. But you're only likely to have that subtle perception if you are neurodivergent. And it can, of course, absolutely be developed by a neurotypical person. They're full of subtle perceptions, but in order to do that, they would have to really they would have to go beyond the diagnostic criteria and know enough autistic people, probably as peers, really. Unless, I suppose, maybe if they, you know, had worked with loads and loads of autistic children, actually, and had a feel and had a sense. In fact, that's a good example of where you probably, as a neurotypical person, would develop an ADAR, but you wouldn't be allowed to say, well, I just kind of know now.
The thing is, though, when I'm training the NHS professionals, they're often, particularly the adult service ones, they're often confused by me because they are used to seeing, particularly the inpatient people, autistic adults in crisis. And I would hopefully never show up at their door because I would hope that I've got enough coping strategies and so on and so forth and support that I wouldn't need that. Hopefully I'm touching all the wood. But they really struggle to compute me, autistic person, who can train them, to the autistic people that they have in their setting, because they're autistic people in crisis, which is a very different thing. So I think often you can end up in a strange situation where you sort of have a confirmation bias about what autistic people look like from an outside perspective.
Absolutely. And part of the reason we're developing quite a conscious, so the unconscious Autdar is happening for safety reasons, probably, and connection reasons. These are my people. And then a more conscious one actually is coming because partly it's now part of your identity and you're wanting to see how it shows up in other people, and you're curious and you're open to that. So actually your Autdar gets stronger and stronger across hopefully a wide cross-section of the population who are, some are in crisis, some are really happy, some are just going about their day. So we are getting this intensive training And it would be great. It would be absolutely wonderful if it was part of an official training process. Actually, it would be very useful. But I reckon we're some time away from that. But something we are not some time away from, sadly, is the end of
the podcast.
This episode of Why Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. Why have we got such a difficult title for me to say? We will be back next time with more conversations that really could last several hours, but will be neatly packaged into just half an hour for you. How kind are we?
Succinct. I'm going to leave them with a Hannah Gadsby quote about people telling you that you are autistic, which is how she experienced it. And it's, I have this piece of information for you that you seem to be missing. You may or may not ready to hear this bit of information, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because knowledge is power, ignorance is a cage, and feelings can be dealt with. And I bid you good day. Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nic King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.